Hi, everyone. My name is Rob Phillips again, and I wanted to talk about a little bit about my experience with building this app. So it's a very complex thing. It goes in a lot of different directions and it has to be corralled, and it's certainly not perfect yet, but I'm actually pretty happy with the way things have turned out as far as things go. Um, I've been in the technology industry for a very long time. I mean, almost from the very beginning, before they even had the internet. I've sort of been doing this stuff. Been a systems admin, Linux admin, I mean, everything. And the kitchen, throwing the kitchen sink and I've done it all, rack them and stack them. And I worked for Dell. I worked for this company called Veritas for a very long time. Um, and One of the things I've been using to help build this app is this thing called, some people might think of it as vibe coding. Some people might think of it as maybe using AI for things. Um, I have actually used quite a bit of it, and I wanted to share my experiences with building this app using, some of these tools because there's lots of problems. And the idea that you can simply make a complex app without knowing anything or knowing very little about how the app should fit together, what authentication mechanisms you should use, what database mechanisms you should use. I mean, how do you interact with the database? I mean, there's just a whole bunch of things that when you use when you want to use something like AI, what ultimately happens is that it sort of makes its own decisions about how it should accomplish those tasks, especially if you the, approach creating your prompts um, in this sort of idempotent way, which means that you simply give it the outcome, you simply define the outcome and kind of let it you define what you want to accomplish and then let it figure out, how to accomplish that. In a lot of ways, I don't think that's a good idea. But anyway, so I wanted to share this Ars Technical article and talk about it for a few minutes. Two major AI coding tools wiped out user data after making cascading mistakes, right? So this is definitely a problem because what happens is that it doesn't know, even if you feed it the entire context of something, it doesn't know what you want to accomplish. It doesn't know what you want to maintain as a state of something. It doesn't understand what you are considering as important. Um, and ultimately, you sometimes have to get into this realm of saying in your prompt that this works, make no changes there. And then you have to get into this realm of being very specific about what you want to accomplish. Everything from, use this key, uh, you know, communicate with the database very specifically about what you're looking for, including the definition. In my case, I use MongoDB a lot, so I define the collection that it actually needs to look at. I define the data structures and how it should define the data structures. So essentially, I start with the structure of the how the data should look in the database, for example, right? Typically, I call these interfaces, and they are a very important place to start. And if you're not using that sort of, methodology, you get things like this. So, uh, in this particular case, they were using Gemini CLI, which is fine. Um, and it's what they say is the emerging field of vibe coding using natural language to generate and execute code through AI models. So this is where if you want to define vibe coding, um, you're talking about without paying close attention to how the code works under the hood. In one case, Google's Gemini destroyed user files while attempting to reorganize them. Yes. So that is the point, right? So, and there's nothing specifically wrong with Google's Gemini. I use it. I use it particularly as a backend, and I'll describe exactly what tools I use because those are important for the ultimate success of your application, right? So, um, the incident unfolded when a project manager experimenting with Google's command line tool watched the AI model execute file operations that destroyed data. And the reason is because the 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 prompts that you gave it, you did not state something along the lines of this is how the data structure works, this is what it's called, make no changes to the data structures, here is the interfaces to the data structures. And this is a big problem if you are in this position of writing, creating an application and yet not knowing how things work together and how they're supposed to work together, and when to let AI do something and when to not let AI do something, right? So there's nothing specifically wrong with the Gemini CLI in particular. I use it, like I said, for all my backend stuff, but ultimately we are in this position of being able to use these very powerful tools, Google AI. And if you have an established code set in particular, um, you have to be very careful about applying, AI uh, to solving problems within your code. I mean, I suggest in particular you have when you have a big established code base already, and you primarily build um, things in such a way that you have firmly defined sort of structures, and then you have a small host of developers who are responsible and who know backwards and forwards the code for their particular specialty, right? So it could be authentication, it could be, it could be database structures, it could be, all kinds of things like even how to connect to the database, what the name of the database is, the interfaces, stuff like that. So there's a whole host of things that I believe if I were starting a small team, I would suggest having specialties within that code. Um, and so the way that we then can go about solving these problems is we ultimately we have to tell AI as we go through this sort of thing that um, this code works, leave it alone, make no changes there. And then you have to basically say within this, within this, smaller set of code, um, we want to accomplish this, and then go ahead and, play around with that. So one of the other things is we want to make decisions about whether the AI, as humans, we want to make decisions about whether the AI is doing the right thing before we ever go ahead and, execute on whatever code we're working on, right? So in other words, we don't automatically just give it this ability to make changes to the code. We have to make some decisions about whether the AI is going down the right path, right? So this is where knowing your code set, it doesn't change that at all. It doesn't change the necessity to know the code set. So um, I'll just make the blanket statement that you cannot build a complex, full stack sort of application um, without knowing what all the pieces are, how they fit together, what can be changed without affecting other things, what, what is the structure of the data? These things are all important to know as humans, right? Because especially when you change context, or don't give it enough context. Unbeknownst to you, there may be things, if you're not careful, there are things in the code that are going to affect other things in the code and so on and so forth. It's going to be this sort of cascading effect that's going to undermine the entire functionality of your code, of your application base. So, um, I'm going to stop sharing this, and I'm going to go ahead and share just a little bit of what I do here. So this is just an app that I built it's a voting app basically, and it's a very complex thing. It uses an entire service to different service to it uses bookends. It's the application I wrote. It uses bookends as essentially an authentication service, which simply then makes it so that when you build the app here, in this particular case, the decentvote.io app, you end up not having to put an entire authentication structure into your app. And it separates this authorization layer. In other words, it sort of does things in a backwards sort of way. And on one sense, it puts the authorization at the top level, and it gives the organization the ability to determine authorization. And then what it does is it passes those uh, those permission sets down to a specific user, and then gives the user this ability to, have permission sets. It's sort of that are defined on the authorization part in the back end, right? So we do the authentication here in the D app, and the authorization is defined way in the back end by the organization. So as you notice, um, I particularly am I particularly like this tool called Cline, because one of the best things that Cline can do is essentially um, you can plan. So here's a little bit of the process I went through. And I asked it, uh, you know, I was trying to solve a problem, really, a problem that was kind of confounding in a sort of difficult way, a difficult thought process, where uh, this, this authentication process was defined on the back end in such a way that I didn't need, for example, some of the collection information. So I really needed to limit it to only a couple of different things, because it was trying to draw information from the wrong sort of uh, data in the MongoDB database, right? So this is where you have to understand your data, right? So essentially what you do is you give it a prompt and you tell it very specifically about what you do, and it reads you try to include whatever context you think is necessary. You simply add it, so you can go over here to we're going to go back here to this and just look at this, and we're just going to look at a service, the server TS file. Essentially, then we can just take this and we can copy it into and make it context. And then we can ask it questions. And then what it does is it ultimately comes back. it'll say, I have the necessary information to formulate a plan. I have the current implementation of DApp controller and the interfaces for book user and perm set. And then what it does is it gives you a plan, right? So as you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, there's a plan and an act part. So it says, it gives you the very specific information about what it does is, like remove the org name parameter from the request parameters, remove the logic that fetches the org from the org names collection, get the URL from the request body, fetch the book user using zero user ID, fetch all the perm sets, filter the public perm sets, filter the private perm sets. Now, these are things, these public perm sets and private perm sets are part of the structure of my application, right? So you go back and the perm sets are defined as private because it's a MongoDB. It's a flag, so it's defined private as true or private as false. And then you have to tell it, okay. But the point is that this is all stuff that is ultimately necessary for you to understand as the user of the, of Cline in this particular case, of the AI, um, to to actually do the right thing. And especially if you have a complex application in front of you, and you've been working on it for a long time, maybe you have a small army of people working on it. This is where you, as a human being, have to know very specifically about what you want to accomplish, right? And then you have to, once you define the prompt that you need for this particular thing. So in other words, I had to define the prompt to say remove the org name. I actually had to tell it I don't want the org name as part of the process for querying the MongoDB database. It doesn't need that information. And I knew that because of the structure of the application, right? So, and then let it give you a path. Let it give you a step-by-step sort of methodology about how it's going to do this, right? So this was sort of my prompt. Get the URL, all this. So this was my prompt. This is basically what I asked it to do, right? And so then what it does is it basically gives you a plan. Let's see, I will now present this plan to the user. I've analyzed the code and your requirements. Here's the plan to update the DApp permission logic. Basically, remove the org name, calling DApp's URL will be retrieved from the request body. The logic for filtering private perm sets will be able to update it to check if private is true. And so it goes, you can look at the plan, you can define it, you can change it at this point, right? Say, I don't like this particular part of the plan because it does this. I don't want you to make any changes to that. And by using this tool, this Cline tool, it actually allows you over time to build a very large, complex app, but doesn't abdicate your responsibility as a developer or an application architect to understand exactly what the application is doing, because you don't want to fall into this realm of losing all of your data in the database, where it changes the structure of things because it doesn't know. It just is trained on what other people have done, and it thinks it thinks it's doing what you asked it to, right? But if you're vague about things, it does by default make some decisions independently of what you wanted. And so you have to be very careful. So in this way, I don't think this sort of application development process is going to improve much for complex applications, right? That we always have to come from the perspective of what do we want as a human? What do we want the application very specifically to do? because these are human things, right? The AI is not human. It doesn't know what we want as human. It doesn't have the criteria for giving us what we want unless we very specifically ask it what we want. And then we can't be general with it. In other words, we have to be very precise about, making our prompts. I mean, we can make an app, for example, we can simply make an app and say, hey, I want you to build me a web scraping app that pulls in data from these URLs, and I want you to take it and clean up the data, and I want you to put it into a CSV file. I mean, really, you could do that, and you would know how to do that just fine. But then after that, okay, what are you going to do with that CSV stuff, right? What are you going to, how are you going to use it? I mean, what purpose does it serve? In the end, what purpose does it serve to, to serve the ends that you're trying to accomplish with your application, right? So, um, let's just talk a little bit about this thing. Um, I do use, and I have on occasion used, I'm going to talk about the differences here. So I use this thing called Cloud Code or Gemini Code Assist or, something like that, right? Um, the problem I think with using Gemini Code Assist very specifically is that it tries to do too much for you without knowing the specifics um, of your it doesn't try to develop a plan that is sort of working with you to solve the specific problems in your application that you want to use. However, it doesn't mean that Gemini is perhaps one of the most powerful coders, like, for example, um, Cline. I'm going to go back over here and I'm just going to close that out. We're going to take a look at the settings. So I use with Cline and Cline, I don't know if you know anything really about Cline specifically, but I use Google Gemini, right? And there's a whole bunch of different APIs or LLMs that you can use in this particular case. And then I actually have a Google Cloud Platform scenario where all of my applications are deployed to Kubernetes, Goober and Google Kubernetes engine. It's kind of hard to say that today, I guess. And also I use the latest model Gemini 2.5 Pro with this. Sometimes, uh, sometimes it takes maybe a little bit too long, but I think it's Gemini 2.5 Pro is just an amazing thing. But I think it needs this thing called Cline in front of it. It needs some sort of coding sort of interface to it. Otherwise, I just don't think it works very well. Gemini Code Assist by itself to me is, you know, uh, it's probably not the best thing to use independent of Cline. But I do use it on occasion, so I sort of go back and forth, and I have this ability to go back and forth with my stuff. Um, and so, in general, you build code from this base of understanding exactly what you want your application to do, exactly how you want it to interact. Like, in this particular case, I'm just going to give you an example. Like, if you it typically has this tendency. I use this thing called MongoDB Atlas, right? And I don't like this idea of having layers between my my code and the interface to the database. So there's this stuff called Mongoose. And whenever you were to ask, if you were to ask Cline, for example, hey, I want you to build me an application that connects with this database. Here's the connection string. And what it tries to do is it tries to use, other methods typically. So Mongoose in this particular case. And so you really have to tell it that, you know, don't use Mongoose, use these tools. And so, you know, I would suggest, like for example, all my code is written in TypeScript using Node.js and Angular on the front end. But it's all written in TypeScript. And so I would suggest scaffolding your application first, defining some of the structure of it, defining exactly what drivers you might need to interact with the database, what do you need to install, and then get all of your NPM sort of stuff installed. You can just have the package.json and then just run npm install and it'll go ahead and do everything you need it to. Get that stuff done first before you start really interacting with AI in any way, and then you can use that structure to define how you want your app to work, exactly what you want the app to do, so on and so forth. So, um, I just wanted to uh, give people kind of an update on how I've been using these tools. And the other thing I will say is that it doesn't abdicate your responsibility of knowing, how to code. Like I had problems with this, for example, this in with TypeScript. It's very specific, especially, if you define your tsconfig.json file in such a way that it's very strict, right? So the node and the express sort of stuff, um, this sort of stuff, this sort of structure changes with changes in, for example, TypeScript versions and stuff like this. So um, at first there were quite a few problems with this sort of structure, this request, sort of thing. And then the next, especially this next thing, express.next function. It wasn't able to figure this out right away about how to do this properly. But now I understand how it works. And so I can basically solve the problem when they come up. So there's all kinds of different things that you as a human being are going to be involved in the process of troubleshooting and fixing stuff. So it certainly helps that you understand the rules. It helps that you understand, for example, which version of TypeScript you're using, which version of Node you're using in this particular case. So be sure you set up, I use the latest version, the latest version of Node, and so then I can just go, nvm install, and what it does is I have an nvmrc file, and what it does is it installs the latest version of Node.js into your application, and then what you can do is just have a package.json file that's pretty common between your applications. So, but anyway, that's it. And if you guys have any questions, drop me a line at robert@grokism.com. Can help you figure out some of the problems you might be having. Especially if you're not a software engineer by trade. I am. And uh, you know, these things can get very frustrating. I have occasionally made mistakes, and I've spent the better part of, 2 days, hard working days, trying to figure out, you know, my mistakes are. So one of the things you want to do is you want to make sure that you push all your code to Git when you get to a point where it works, right? And then the other thing is, particularly if you want to deploy this stuff to like Kubernetes or stuff, there are these uh, issues with, you know, uh, you don't want to push your secrets basically to Git. So you have to have a Git ignore file that ignores all that stuff. But then you have to keep track of it separately. So be sure to back up that stuff. Be sure to understand what it is. And then uh, when you actually get ready to deploy your stuff to Kubernetes, for example, or Docker or whatever it is, um, it can actually then you can really tell. I will say that it's one of the better things that Cline can do in particular is, and Gemini Code Assist can do this pretty well too, but it can be a systems admin for you. It can be a CI/CD sort of DevOps sort of person. So, and it makes it pretty easy to actually go ahead and just basically tell it I want to deploy to my Kubernetes cluster, build all the manifest files for me. Here's the ingress rules. But again, it does mean that you still have to know all that stuff, right? Once you know it though, then you can basically say, hey, I want to duplicate this over other applications I want to do this for many different sort of processes, right? So I love it. I think it's great. And it sort of gives people, in my particular case, I mean, even though I'm a pretty good TypeScript Node.js developer, this would be difficult, very difficult, to the point of maybe I wouldn't be able to do it completely if I mean I think I would be able to figure it out, but I wouldn't be able to do it completely without being able to use some of these tools like Cline. It would take me a very, very, very long time, and I wouldn't be able to get other things done. So what this is doing is it's allowing me, a single person, to be able to make an app, deploy it, secure it, do all the things that has to happen with it. Um, and it allows me as a single software engineer to be able to do all this stuff in such a way that, um, it, I can do it, right? I can be a sysadmin, or I can let Cline be a sysadmin. I can be a DevOps person, or I can let Cline be a DevOps person. But again, it's this base of knowledge, this base of you know of understanding what your environment is, understanding what your code does, having a real understanding of the structure of it, how it interacts with everything. But once you have a really good idea of what exactly you want your app to do, step by step by step by step, you can actually build incredibly complex, incredibly important apps as a single person, using these AI tools. It's allowing people like myself to do things in ways that they've never been able to do. It doesn't remove my humanity. It actually extends it and makes it better so that I can put something out there that is really human, that is built for the purpose of humans, and yet use the tools. I think it's wonderful. Personally, I think this is a great sort of time to be a human. I am very excited about this. I'm really just starting to come to understand how this stuff works quite well. But anyway, you know, you're going to make mistakes. You're going to have to make sure that you set up systems that allow you to make mistakes so that you don't undermine all kinds of different code. And so, you know, you don't want to have to go back and rebuild the whole thing from scratch. So use Git, uh, be very specific, back up your stuff quite often when you get to a point that works like you want it to. And use Cline, which is an extension. If I look at my extensions here, it's just an extension. And be sure that you make good use of the plan button, and then press act only when you're sure of what you want to do, of exactly what you want to accomplish. But anyway, that's it. Thanks, folks. Bye-bye.